Let's start just with the outlook for the fiscal fourth quarter, around $65 billion. Depending on where you stood going into that, that is meaningfully above consensus to some. How do you react to that data point?
Yeah, the data point is that the slope of the spend is continuing to move higher. And I think that that was a concern going into the print, especially after Jensen sort of let the cat out of the bag on how strong demand has been going with the $500 billion of backlog that he talked about at GTC back in October. And, I think expectations because of that had increased going into expectations for the results for the October quarter as well as the guidance. And so, with the acceleration of revenue in both the October quarter versus July and then further acceleration into the January quarter, I think that took away, some of the concerns. And then, the commentary on the call, which I thought was very important, was that they're obviously taking more orders. And so I think you just talked about this, which is that there could be, there will be further upside to that $500 billion backlog as we think about 26. One of the things, in addition to the slope increasing, is that the runway here is increasing. So we get a lot of questions from investors around sustainability of the spend. Obviously, the hyperscalers have been increasing CapEx on a quarterly basis for quite a while right now. But these types of data points would suggest that the runway on the spend and the demand for AI compute continues to lengthen. And so I think those are very strong data points for the AI trade for looking forward.
Ruben, just as you were speaking, Nvidia's gain is now just 0.9% in a session. I'm not saying that's your fault. That's just curious timing. The base case assumption is zero revenues from China. Jensen could not have been more clear about that. But does that not then give quite a lot of opportunity for some upside if they can get the China situation resolved?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think at some point it is likely that we'll see companies like Nvidia and potentially AMD and others figure out ways to work with both governments. The company talked about this on the call last night, but to your point, even without China, and this came up on last quarter. I mean, they had a beat and another raise without any H20 assumptions in the guidance. But even without that, you do have what I mentioned, which is the hyperscale capex going up. And I think something that is still not fully appreciated is the rate at which sovereign governments are spending on AI. So we talk about the five major hyperscalers in the United States and the capex budgets that are growing there, but Nvidia is doing quite a bit of growth in sovereign nation AI deployments, and I think that that's something that's going to continue as well. So even without China, obviously there's a big demand backdrop here, and like I said, that backdrop is extending into sort of a multi-year investment cycle.
Jensen and the company more broadly really spelled out again, they own 90% of the AI accelerator market, or the data center market. Is that going to change? You just referenced AMD.
Yeah, I think at some point you will see just if for nothing else capacity that Nvidia can bring to the table could enable others to participate here. The hyperscalers obviously have their own ASIC platforms that they're trying to bring to the market, but I think the way to think about this is that the overall TAM assumptions continue to rise, right? So a year ago or so, we were talking about multiple hundreds of billions of dollars in potential AI compute TAM, and now we're talking about trillions of dollars, right? So Nvidia's talked about $1 to $3 trillion. AMD had an analyst meeting just a few weeks ago where they talked about $1 trillion TAM as you get out to the end of the decade. And as that TAM increases, even if Nvidia's share comes down, which it likely will, I think this concept of all boats rise. They're going to continue to grow revenue in our view. Just on the overall TAM assumption increasing.